attendance and your participation. I don't know that I formally introduced myself in our plenary earlier, but my name is Reverend Ashley Mayhem, and I am MBA Social Entrepreneurship Program Coordinator. So I know that you've received a lot of emails from me, hopefully not too many, but we're really grateful to have you all here. If you're comfortable turning your video on, we welcome you to do that so that we can see each other's faces and kind of put faces to names. This is the grant research workshop. I just want to make sure I didn't say the wrong one. Grant research workshop, and a friend and colleague, Haifa Baptiste, is with us today, and she's going to be sharing some tips, tricks, insight into the world of grant research. And so we're really grateful for her wisdom here. I know that grant writing and grant research is a necessary component of social enterprise, and sometimes it can feel overwhelming. And so we're grateful for her experience here. And I will turn it over to Haifa and invite you to share a little bit about yourself in the world and your background. So we're thankful to have you all here.
Thank you so much, Ashley. My name is Haifa Baptiste, and I am a nonprofit consultant. I've been working in the nonprofit sector for about 9 years now, primarily doing fundraising and having done a lot of grant research and writing for nonprofit organizations working in mental health, education, sort of healthcare, and a lot of different areas and categories, humanities and arts. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm so glad that you guys invited me to participate in this conference. And I look forward to sharing a little bit about grant research with you all. So with that, I am going to share my screen. Okay, so it's telling me advanced screen sharing options. Oh, there I am. Here we go. So. Right, so the focus of this presentation is really just to give you guys some basic knowledge on grant research, particularly as it relates to nonprofit organizations. If you are starting a nonprofit or currently are operating a nonprofit, and these are just some tips and things that I keep in mind when I'm looking for funders for my clients, and I hope it'll be useful to you. So I just want to do a brief sort of overview of some of the things that we'll be touching on today. So we'll talk about, organizational needs, understanding your organization's needs in terms of their funding needs. We'll also look at different types of funders, like corporate funders, foundations, government. We'll talk about grant research tools that might be helpful for you if you are, at a stage where that may be beneficial. And then I'll share some, additional tips and things to really pay attention to when you're researching for funding. So one of the first things that you are going to want to do as an organization is really sort of ask yourself some basic questions before you even dive into, the research process, because it's really going to guide your experience and your actions in terms of where you look for funding and what kind of funding you consider. So you want to think about what your organizational needs are. Are you a brand new organization that is looking for a funder to fund a pilot program? Are you an existing organization that just needs operational funds? Think about how much funding you need, because grant writing is really just a part of should just be a part of a bigger fundraising strategy. So you want to think about, how much how much do you want to bring in from grants versus other methods of fundraising? So having an idea of like how much funding you're looking for in general from your grant writing sort of methods, or just for a particular grant is going to be important, and it will help you determine what funders to look at. And what programs and initiatives are you looking to fund? That's important too. And that sentence is not complete, but what programs and initiatives are you looking to fund? So that's really important for you to consider. And then also, how will you spend the funds? Is this funding that is going to be spent on sort of, your everyday operating expenses? Are they going to be spent on particular staff salaries? Are they going to be spent on materials and supplies for your program? So these are all things that you want to think about when you're beginning your research process, because these will determine what kind of funders you qualify for. So I always tell organizations, just, I kind of go through this exercise with them to figure out, okay, what are we looking at? Are we looking at capital? Are we looking at operating? Are we looking at programs? Because that's going to really determine what kind of funding you qualify for. And so there are a few different types of grant funders. You have your corporations, your foundations, which can also be corporate foundations. And then you have your government agencies, right? So you have 3 levels or 3 or more levels of government agencies that provide funding. You have your federal agencies, your state, and your local municipal governments, who also provide grant opportunities to organizations, and whether they be nonprofits or individuals, or social corporate social organizations. So I want to talk a little bit about corporate funding. So one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind about corporate funding is it's not purely charitable. Corporate fundraising or corporate giving programs tend to be very strategic, right? So, when you think about your big corporations, your Walmarts and other organizations like that, they're really looking to support organizations whose missions also support and align with their interest, right? Think of like banks, for example. If you go to, almost any bank's, sort of social or corporate giving program, you'll notice that they'll support things like programs that support entrepreneurs, or programs that support sort of community development, because that is ultimately in their interest as a bank to kind of grow, programs and support programs that support these things. So you do have to kind of think about, when you're thinking about your alignment with a corporate funder, how your organization might be appealing to them. So they look for value in their charitable partnerships, right? Maybe you serve an audience that they want to reach, or maybe they're looking to have good sort of goodwill in the community and good PR, and they're looking for recognition opportunities, because more and more it's becoming important for companies to be socially responsible and to be involved in community. So it's really important for you to think about your alignment with the interest of the corporation, as well as what charitable action or what charitable giving they can provide your organization. And so these organizations tend to give as part of a general like corporate social responsibility program, or they may have a private foundation that they operate that is exclusively for charitable reasons. But outside of just how your organization aligns with their interests, I think it's important to consider how your values align. If you are an organization with specific values or specific needs, making sure that your values and your interests are also in alignment with that of a particular corporation is important, because you don't want to be seen as contradicting your own values, right? So there are certain organizations that maybe won't partner with corporations because they see their the values as opposed. So it's also important for you to kind of think about your own values as a nonprofit, and think about how that aligns with, this organization's image, this corporation's image, their identity, and that sort of thing. And someone had a question about preferred fundraising software packages or monitoring grants and charitable gifts. I think Dr. Anthony Everett. So there is we do go into that a little bit towards later on in the presentation. So we will touch on that. So the next sort of funder type that I want to go over is foundations. And that includes private family foundations, community foundations, and corporate foundations, which we touched on a little bit. And so private foundations are usually funded by one individual or family or a company in the case of a corporate foundation. And they don't receive any funds from the public. So you and I, we can't go into a private foundation website and donate to them. So some examples of that include, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Coca-Cola Foundation. So if you go to any of those websites, you'll see that you're not really able to donate or support them. Whereas community foundations are considered public charities and they can receive donations. So you can go to your local community foundation's website and click a fund and donate to that fund. So that's the difference between private and community foundations. And all foundations, they have to distribute 5% of the prior year's net investment assets to charities. They have to distribute that money for charitable purposes. And that's so that they can be in compliance with the IRS regulations. Now they can give more than 5%. That 5% is just sort of the minimum that they are required to give. So I wanted to touch a little bit more on community foundations because I think they are really great resources for nonprofits, especially if you are new and you're just starting to do a little bit of research. They are considered public charities and they often do have competitive grants, meaning that you can submit, they have some kind of grant application process or cycle where you can submit for funding and potentially receive funding if after you've gone through the vetting process and they've chosen the charities that they're going to fund. But more importantly, they really help to facilitate community philanthropy, right? They are there to connect donors and philanthropists in your community to the causes they care about. So having a good relationship with them is important because they can help you get funding from the very people who are looking to fund the type of work that you're doing. So here in almost every community, there is a community foundation, whether it's regional or like city, depending on what the population looks like where you are. Here where I am in Orlando, that's the Central Florida Foundation, and they cover a couple of different counties in the area, and they really are there to just kind of facilitate the philanthropy and connect you and your organization with donors that care about what you're doing. So having a good relationship with them, calling them and telling them about your goals or your plans for your organization. They're in my community anyway. I can't speak for everywhere else. They're always really receptive to hearing from you and hearing about what you're doing, because it's kind of their job to know what's happening in the community and who's doing what, so that they can bridge that, those relationships between donors and the causes. So it's always my suggestion to have a really good relationship with your local community foundation. So government grants are, they're kind of I think for a lot of organizations, they seem intimidating, especially on the federal level. But government grants can be federal, state, or local municipal grants. So at every level of government, you can receive funding for different things. And federal grants have opportunities for individuals, for-profit businesses, and charities. And they don't strictly, when I say federal grants, but like the grants.gov website where you go to look at all the federal grants. There's also, co-op agreements and also contracts and things like that. So it's not strictly just grants on that website, but we're gonna, kind of stick to grants for the purposes of this presentation. but yeah, so there are tons of different agencies and they each have their own grant opportunities, right? So you, for example, you have the Small Business Association. They'll have grants for, for initiatives and things that are related to helping small businesses. Department of Health and Human Services, the same. They'll have like a list of grants that they roll out that have to do with that, and as well as the National Endowment for the Arts. They'll have like their own grants that they do each year, and new opportunities will come up, every year for arts and humanities. So it's really just about making sure that you are keeping track of, what agencies might be of relevance to your organization, to make sure that you are keeping track of grant opportunities that might be available there. And I wanted to kind of show you guys, for anyone who's not familiar with the grants.gov website, do like a short demonstration of how that website works. So I'm going to stop sharing this for now. And we're going to go to that. So this is the grants.gov website where all of the federal grants are. And it can be a little bit intimidating because there's a lot of information on this page. There's videos, there's tutorials, there's just a ton of stuff. But I would say that if you are new to to federal grants, this tab here is very helpful. And it's basically the grants learning center. So you can probably teach yourself. There's a lot of webinars and paid sort of training on doing federal grants, and those are great and helpful. But there is a ton of information on this site. So if you're really determined and you don't have the budget to pay for a webinar or training specifically on federal grants, you will find a lot of useful information here. So if you click the grants 101, it'll tell you all about the cycles, the grant life cycle for federal grants. There's a lot of information here. There's like grant terminology, because the applications, they all have they have their own terminology that they use on the federal level. And so there's a lot of there's a glossary of different words that, you might come across in an application that may not be words that you're familiar with, or you may not be sure what it means. So, this kind of goes over all of that so that you can go back and kind of reference it and understand what is being asked for in the application. So, I always encourage people to just kind of really take the time to go over this sort of learning tab, because it's really helpful in understanding, what grants you might qualify for, and it just helps you understand the federal grant process in general. But to just to show you what that looks like. So this is all of the grants that are either posted, that means they're open and accepting applications, or they're forecasted, meaning they're going to open sometime in the future, or they're likely to open sometime in the future. So on this section over here is where you would filter things so that you can find the specific type of grants that you are looking for. And there are a lot of really it's a really powerful tool, and you can really kind of narrow down exactly what you're looking for. You can put in keywords. If there's an opportunity number, if this wasn't something that you received in an email, you can look by the opportunity number. There's opportunity status. Is it a posted grant that's open, or is it forecasted? You can even look at the ones that have recently closed, and there are tons that have been archived. You can look by funding instrument type. For the purposes of this, we're talking about grants, but there are cooperative agreements, there are procurement contracts as well listed here, but primarily it's grants. Your eligibilities, there's grants for individuals, there's grants for cities and townships and governments, county governments, nonprofits, you can narrow it down in that way. And of course, the category that you're working on, agriculture, energy, environment, there are a lot of different ways that you can kind of narrow it down so that you can find the specific type of grants that you're looking for. And of course, you can sort by agency. If there's a specific agency that you want to look at grants from the Department of Health and Human Services, you can narrow it down that way as well. So this is just one of the tools that you can use to look for federal grants. And then this is another grant tool that I've used. It's called Grant Watch, and it's a similar database, but this is not federal grants. This is just kind of like corporate and foundation grants, and there's some federal grants in here as well. It's a mix of all the funding opportunities that are available, regardless of the type of agency that's funding it. So here you can apply filters for your interests depending on what you're looking to fund, what kind of programs you're looking to fund. Here you can put your geographic focus. You can narrow it down by state, or it can be national. The recipient of the grant, is it a nonprofit? Is it a small business or an individual? You can narrow it down by, and then of course you can use keywords. So these are just kind of the tools that you can use to start looking at grants. This Grant Watch is a paid subscription, and most of them are, except for grants.gov, which is free. Anybody can just kind of log on there and research it. It's government grants, so it's accessible to everyone. But a lot of the grant research databases and tools that you'll see will be paid subscriptions, and the cost of those grants, of those subscriptions, vary. So you'll just have to kind of see what's in your budget. And if you're just starting, as a nonprofit, you're just researching grants for the first time, I wouldn't recommend subscribing to anything, because Google is very powerful as well, right? I still use Google to look for grant opportunities. So I'm going to go back to our presentation. So yeah, so we kind of went over all of the different grant databases that you can look for, that you can use to kind of search your grants. But yeah, Google is free and effective, but it is time consuming. It's not the same as having a bunch of opportunities kind of put there for you and you just have to sort through them. With Google, you basically have to start from nothing. But you can still find really good opportunities if you're pretty good at Google. And I think when it comes to, whether it's grant research tools that like I just showed you, or Google, I think that knowing the keywords that are relevant to your program, to your organizations, knowing, how are people talking about the kind of work that you're doing, and understanding the keywords and the key phrases that are being used in your field or in your sort of line of work is going to make it very, a lot easier for you to find the kind of grants that you're after, and understanding how your funders would talk about them and describe them as well. So yeah, and grant management tools are, again, these are tools that you can use to keep track of your grants. If you are an organization that has a kind of a bigger grant management sort of operations aspect to your organization, I think a lot of major universities and organizations that submit a ton of grants will typically be the ones that will need some kind of grant management tool to keep track of where they're submitting their grants and when they're due, and planning the submission, keeping track of contact information, and keeping track of deadlines. So there are tools that you can use as well to do that. But if you're a smaller organization or you're just getting started, an Excel spreadsheet is effective and it's free if you have Microsoft Office already. that really is that's really all you need. But if you are an organization that is big and, you submit a lot of grants every year, you might want to consider some kind of database to keep track of that as well. And I have an example here that I want to show you all of Instrumental, which is kind of, which is a tool that you can use to keep track of your grants. And I will share that with you. And Instrumental is great because it's also a grant research tool and a tracking tool. So, you have a project here, let's see, academic fellowship. You have like, it automatically will populate new opportunities that match the criterias that you've selected. So, every day I log in and there might be new opportunities that I haven't seen yet, and it'll kind of populate at the top. But then you are also able to, you can save opportunities and put them at a certain status. If you're planning or you're in progress, you're submitting, and then you can kind of just track where you are with different opportunities. So these are the kinds of things that might be helpful if you're a big organization and you have a pretty large amount of grants that you're submitting every year. You can keep a track of the ones that you're researching. You can keep the ones that you've submitted, and then you can organize them however makes the most sense to you. So these are the kinds of tools that you would use if you are if you're an organization that does a substantial amount of grant writing every year. It might be something that you might want to invest in. So, if you're an organization or you have a business or something, and you're looking at, okay, where do I even start? Let's say you've never even looked for a grant a day in your life. My suggestion is always to start local, especially if you're a nonprofit. Think of who are the key players in your community. Who are the major companies? The companies with the most employees, the companies with the most revenue. Are there any notable philanthropists or notable like community foundations in your local community? Because I feel like a lot of the times when you're getting funding for the first time, it's more likely that you are going to get funding from someone or some organization that is local to you, that is close to the work that you're doing and can see, sort of the impact that you're having on the community. So I always tell, new organizations to start local. Look in your backyard, before you go and you start looking elsewhere. Look for, some of the low-hanging fruit that's right, in your immediate surroundings. I mean, you'll be surprised at the kind of support you can get from, your local community in terms of grants and that sort of thing. I also say look at similar organizations, right? So if you're an organization that's focused on mental health, what are some other organizations in your community that are focusing on mental health? Who is funding them? Usually on organizations' websites, you can look at, sometimes they'll have like partners and people who have sponsored things for them. So you can kind of make notes that, okay, these are the kinds of organizations that are funding my program, because these are the organizations that you've researched that are similar to you are getting funding from these companies or these foundations. And so it gives you kind of a starting point of who you can approach for funding. And you can check their websites and you can check their annual reports for that information. And the annual report is a lot of, and not every nonprofit will have it, but a lot of nonprofits do have annual reports where they kind of, do a summary of the past year. And they talk about, the funding they had, the successes they've had, and they thank all of their donors. And usually they will list all of the donors on there. And then you can kind of take a look at who's giving to that organization. I also said, build relationships with your local community foundations, because it's really they're really just there to facilitate philanthropy in the community. So having a good relationship with them will help you along the way when opportunities come up for funding. And I will say also building a network to talk, with other grant seekers in your community. And I know that's in some places or some organizations, are reluctant to do that because they think it's like, oh, more competition. But it's really helpful to gain insight because, opportunities, there's not really that much scarcity in terms of like funding. I know sometimes it feels that way and it feels like everybody's competing for the same opportunities. But I think that, being open to sharing and really helping other organizations, sharing resources, sharing information is ultimately in the best interest of everybody. So I do recommend building a network and really sharing information with other or similar or other organizations in your community who are also seeking grants. And here locally in Orlando, we have like a grant affinity group where we all go. It's like once a month we meet up and we chat about challenges we're having with grants, and we share opportunities that are coming up. So I think something like that is very helpful in terms of because sometimes opportunities happen because of people you happen to know or conversations you happen to have that may not be apparent to you otherwise. So I think that is a good strategy as well for finding funding for your organization. And so, one of the things that I think about when you think you found a potential funder, it's really important to make sure it's the right fit. And so reading the grant descriptions and eligibility requirements very carefully is really important. I think, this day and age, there's so many distractions, and I'm guilty of this as well. We tend to skim things, we tend to look for things that kind of see what we want to see sometimes. But I think with grant research, it's really, really important that you really take the time and you read the descriptions and the eligibility requirements, because it can be so easy to miss important things. So I definitely recommend it because sometimes, there have been times where I have found grants that were perfect for an organization that I was researching for in every way, except, in one line it said that, we only fund organizations in Texas and I'm in Florida. So it's really important that you read those carefully because it is very easy to miss information that is crucial to your process in terms of like the grant submission process. You want to make note of any geographic restrictions because I think that's the one that catches people a lot. Amounts and deadlines, of course, because if you miss the deadline, you cannot apply. And when I talk about amounts, like grant amounts, like as in what the organization typically will give out in terms of funding. Because I'll say this, like not every organization, not every foundation or grant making organization is super clear about everything. You will find some very, very vague grant descriptions there on websites and things, and you're left with more questions than answers. So sometimes organizations will have a page where they will have past grantees, people that they've given money to in the past. So if you're not sure if you're a great fit, if that information is available, you can look at who they've given to before. And are these organizations similar to yours, or do you see any kind of like similarities between you and the kinds of organizations they funded in the past? If that's the case, then you can feel good and know that is a good potential funder for you. Like for example, some organizations or some funders might say, we support, programs that address education. Let's say you're an after-school tutoring, your organization does after-school tutoring. That would technically fall into that category. But if you look on their past grantees and they've only given to, universities for research and things like that, then you would understand that that's not necessarily a good fit for you as a funder. So it's really important to kind of like, look at all of the elements on their website to see, to kind of come to the conclusion about whether or not you should submit to this, to this funder, because grant writing is such a, it can be, not always, but it can be a very long process, depending on what they're asking for. So you want to make sure that if you're investing the time into this process, that you are doing it, and that you have a good chance of getting that funding. So you don't want to spend a lot of time on something that you probably don't have a chance at getting. Yeah, so making sure that you're looking at the geographic restrictions, trying to understand what amounts they've given, will help you, because you don't want to ask for $30,000 to an organization that typically only gives $5,000. So as much as you can, find out as much information about the funder and their giving process. But you can also check, if that information is not on their website, if they have a 990, which is a form that they have to file with the IRS every year. And that information could be on their website, or it could be on GuideStar, if they on their GuideStar profile. You can look at, there's usually a page there where they have to kind of show all of the funds that they distributed that year. So there'll be names of charities and organizations that they gave to, and the amounts. And then you can do your own research on those charities and see, okay, do these organizations align with me and what I'm trying to do? Yeah, and that's how you make sure that their interest align with your organization's work, so that you're not spending a ton of time, on a grant proposal for an organization that maybe doesn't necessarily give to organizations like yours. And the last thing I want to kind of emphasize is, submission requirements very carefully, because each funder will have a different submission requirement. There have been funders that I've worked with that required 5 copies of the application. There are some funders who just want 1 page, no more than 1 page of you, requesting and talking about your program. So you have to read those submission requirements really carefully and see what kind of information you need to include in your application, but also what kind of documents, supporting documents you need to include with your application. Just last week, I had an organization submit a $50,000 grant, and they're a newer organization. They've only been around for about 2 years, and one of the submission requirements was, an audited financial, like to submit their audited financials. They don't have audited financials. They've only been around for 2 years. So in that case, I was able to reach out to the funder directly and let them know that, and they were able to provide an alternative document that we could provide. So, so you want to make sure that you're reading that, those requirements, those submission requirements. What documents are they requesting? What specifically, making sure you're answering the questions, the way that they are intended to be answered. And one thing that I will say is, and this won't be the case for every foundation or every funding source, but if there is a contact person that you can reach to ask questions and to get clarification on anything, I highly, highly recommend it. Because you don't want to guess, you don't want to, assume. If you're unsure about something, and there's somebody that you can reach out to ask a question, I absolutely recommend you reaching out and, whether it's calling or emailing, to get clarification on, even if it's just, you're not sure if your program is a good fit, you can ask them, and you can, if they've made themselves accessible to the public in that way, you can call and ask, you can have a conversation with somebody who works there. And some places, will be able to do that, and others won't, because of the sheer amount of requests that they get. So that's not always going to be an option, but if it is, I do recommend it. And I think we had a question in the chat. Miriam asked, can a church apply for foundation grants? If not, what does the church need to apply for to apply for smaller grants. So typically, yes, churches can usually apply for foundation grants. I think a lot of the restrictions that you will see regarding churches or kind of religious institutions is that it can't be strictly for religious purposes. So if you have if you're a church and you have a program that feeds the community, you can typically apply for pretty much any grant a nonprofit can apply for. I think a lot of funders probably have a sort of restrictions about funding being used strictly for religious purposes, but not necessarily. I don't think I've ever seen like churches or any kind of religious institutions being barred from applying in most cases. So I think this is all that I have for the presentation in terms of the information that I wanted to share with you guys. So now I'm going to open it up to questions. If anybody has additional questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or if you would like to kind of just ask, you can kind of put your camera on and ask as well.
As people are maybe thinking through questions to lift up here. So I heard in this very detail oriented, requires us to do some research on the front end. For some of us in these younger phases of development for social enterprises, this is like, I don't have time to do all this. I don't have the know-how, although you've given us like such a great overview of resources that we can use. What if we want to outsource the research or the writing of a grant researcher or writer? Where do we start? Where do we contact someone like yourself? What do those rates typically look like? Just so people have a sense of what getting that kind of support might look like for their enterprise.
Sure. So, if you are like a lot of nonprofits, typically, I think grant writing and research is one of the main things that nonprofits outsource, because it is time consuming and you may not necessarily have the time, especially if you're a newer organization, you're juggling a lot of things. Or some even really established organizations just don't have somebody dedicated to it. So I work with an organization called the Nonprofit Spot, and we are nonprofit consultants. And one of the main things that we do is grant writing and research for organizations. So we'll typically start with, and kind of an assessment of your organization, where you are, what your goals are, what your needs are as an organization. And then we'll probably, do some research. Like the phase one will be like, researching opportunities that might align with you and your organization's needs. And then we will kind of like present those opportunities to you. And we can kind of like go over them and we'll like help you prioritize based on, what we think is good for you. And then whatever grants we decide to move forward with, then we would get into the grant writing phase of that and sort of preparing, the documents and the, if it's the first time you've ever written a grant, that's always the hardest one, because you have to find the language and find the everything that you need to get, to submit to that opportunity. But after that, it gets easier because you can take bits and pieces that you've already written. And, like, I feel like all the grants are like little bits and pieces of things that you've written before, and you kind of tailor it to that organization, and maybe you write some additional pieces as well. But it is and that can, as far as like the rate, our rate, we typically start at $60 an hour for that kind of work. But, it really varies on, different grant writers and grant research and organizations will have different rates for that. But typically that's kind of like, I feel like the medium sort of rate for that kind of work. And there's, there's a lot of places that you can look for, grant writers, on the web. Like a quick Google search, and you will find plenty of people who write grants or research grants for you. Upwork is one of the places that you can go to get any kind of freelancer that you're in need of. But yeah, and I think
we have one question in the chat from AW Shield. She says she wants to know, are there grants that allow you to build wealth or invest for your organization so that you aren't grant dependent forever? Or is going the grant route sort of the perpetual position you're taking as an organization?
So I think what you are referring to is an endowment, because that's kind of what, like if you're a nonprofit, you kind of set up an endowment that, then you use the interest to kind of serve your needs. A lot of times I will say grants will not support endowments. I don't think I've come across, that's usually one of the restrictions that they have. So they typically will give you the money to do a program, but they won't necessarily help you create an endowment for your organization. So yeah, typically endowments are something that you have to create from scratch, from your own donors and your own sort of networks and things like that. But as far as I've seen, I've not yet come across a grant that will let you, use that funding towards an endowment. Yeah, so I will share my organization's info here, the nonprofit spot. And you can email me if you have questions, if you want to talk about anything related to grant writing or grant research. And I will put that in the chat for everyone. And our website is just thenonprofitspot.com.
Any other questions? I know I said it in the, Richard Williams, he says, will grants fund you without a track record of success first?
That's a good question. It can be more difficult to get a grant if you don't have a track record of success. But there's so many factors that kind of go into that. So I don't want to say that, no, you're absolutely not going to get a grant if you don't have a track record, but it does help to kind of establish your credibility, because when these funders are looking to give to organizations, they are definitely looking to invest their money wisely. So if you do have a sort of a credible record of doing work in your community and if you've done something in the community, whether it's programming or, whatever it is, whatever that looks like for you, that will definitely make it easier to get funding. I don't recommend like grants as a primary strategy for new organizations that are just getting off the ground, that haven't really done a ton of work. Because I think sometimes like people reach out to me and they're like, I want to start an organization to do X, Y, or Z. Can you help me find grants? And that's always a hard conversation because, a lot of these organizations do require that you have some kind of, track record, that the people on your, you have a board of directors, you have a lot of kind of pieces in place before they will consider you for funding. So it's usually, to me, it's not usually the very first strategy that I would recommend for funding if you are brand new. Now, you don't have to have a ton of experience doing a particular thing to get grant funding. If you've been in operation for about a year, and you have a track record of doing work in the community, absolutely you can get grants. I would start local for sure, but you can definitely get grants. But as the very first sort of strategy to launch your organization, I don't think that's typically the way to go. Any other questions?
Well, Haifa, thank you so much. I know it's a lot of information, a lot of great information, a lot of great resources. Um, we really want to encourage you, if you haven't yet accessed Hoova, um, how do we work to build credibility? That was a good question. Last question.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I think building credibility starts with launching programs in your community, even if you start small. Like if, because I feel like a lot of people who have ideas for nonprofits have a lot of great ideas. They want to have all kinds of things and do all kinds of work and address all different kinds of needs. But even if you just do one thing, right? One small thing that can help build credibility, right? Look for partners in your community who already have credibility, right? How can you kind of tie them into the work that you're doing? That will help you build credibility as well. Partnering with other organizations that are addressing similar needs. Of course, you're not going to be addressing the exact same thing, but making sure that you have partnerships and that you are working with the people in your community that are already addressing similar issues or doing similar work, will definitely help you build credibility. But I think ultimately it comes down to just doing the work and having a track record of serving people or providing the programs or the initiatives that you're doing. I think that will definitely help you build the credibility.
That
And I
lends
think one other thing is like showing that there is a need for the work that you're doing, and that there's community buy-in and community support for the work that you're doing is important. Because sometimes I think sometimes organizations will want to do something, but okay, who in the community is buying into this and is participating in this? That's important, making sure that people are invested and that they are, that they believe that there's a need for this as well.
Yeah, that lends itself well. I've already been noticing the different conversation topics that have cropped up on Hoova. There are a lot of you who are connecting. I know many of you are already serving or you have an idea for a project. And we really hope that you not only, are inspired and equipped and educated throughout the course of this seminar, but that it functions to connect you with other people who feel called and passionate about addressing certain social needs. And so there are already some really cool conversations that are popping up in Hoova. I really strongly recommend and invite you to take a look there, and you can engage Haifa in the coming week or so. And you can connect with her. Her contact information that she shared in the chat is also in Hoova. So that's stored there, so you don't have to memorize it or cut and paste. But we're really grateful, Haifa, for your time and for your wisdom that you shared. And looking forward to our last workshop. There's only one workshop at 3:30 Central, so that's in about 35 minutes. And that's the other side of the coin to the grant world, and that is the grant writing workshop. So we look forward to seeing you over there, and we'll catch you on the other side. Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you.